Perception is a very important topic in cognitive psychology. We are often unaware that all of the sensory information we take in must be meaningfully interpreted. Most, if not all, instances of perception involve pattern recognition, which is the classification of a stimulus into a category. Pattern recognition is central to perception because when we meaningfully interpret a stimulus, we form a percept, and the formation of most percepts involves some classification and recognition. To explain pattern recognition, we will discuss three approaches: Gestalt, top-down, and bottom-up.
Gestalt psychologists are concerned with people's perception of objects as they relate to the whole. When interpreting objects, Gestalt psychologists believe perceivers follow certain rules of organization. In short, this form of perception abandoned the idea that people identify objects based on its individual parts, but instead we initially perceive the object as a whole. Kurt Kafka, a well-known Gestalt psychologist in the early 1900s, discussed 5 main principles of perceptual organization that allow us to see objects as whole instead of parts. The first principle of organization is the principle of proximity, or nearness. This principle states that those objects nearer to one another are perceived in such a way, and as a result, grouped together. Do you see rows or do you see columns? The second principle of organization is the principle of similarity. Those objects that are similar to one another are naturally grouped together. Now what do you see? Rows or columns? A third principle concerned with perceptual organization is the principle of good continuation. This principle states that individuals group together objects that form a continuous straight or a curved line. Do you see the top image is made up of the 2 objects in the middle or on the bottom? The fourth principle is known as the principle of closure. People utilizing this principle mentally fill in the gaps in an object in order to see a closed, complete, and whole object. What object do you see? The fifth and final principle is the principle of common fate. Those objects that move together will, as a result of their movement, be grouped together. When using these principles, we often select the method that creates the most simple and stable image. As a result, symmetric, simple forms are more commonly experienced than more complex, asymmetrical images. Further research on Gestalt principles have been well documented over time, supporting the idea that the larger figure is more perceptually relevant than its smaller components. Unfortunately, critics have discredited Gestalt psychology's ability to explain cognitive and psychological processes. How do we know which images are simple and which are complex? Do we see objects as simple after we thought process through them, or do we understand mentally what is simple and then form the images? Critics of Gestaltism seek to find these answers.
Bottom-up processing is another approach to pattern recognition. Bottom-up implies that the process is data-driven. The perceiver starts with small bits of information to form a percept. The bottom-up model would explain that you conclude this object to be a table because you saw its 4 legs and flat top. Template matching is one example of the bottom-up model. In this model, every stimulus we encounter is compared to some previously stored pattern or template. The process of perception involves looking for a match between the incoming information and the templates we have stored. This model has a number of problems, however, because it does not explain how and when templates are created, as well as how we keep track of an ever-growing number of them. Another model of bottom-up processing is featural analysis, which states that a whole pattern is recognized by breaking it into its features. There are a number of studies that provide evidence for featural analysis. Irving Biederman proposed a theory of perception involving 36 geons, or simple geometric components like the ones shown on the left. Biederman proposed that we can combine these basic geons to represent the thousands of common objects that we can quickly recognize, such as some of the examples on the right. In 1963, Ulrich Neisser confirmed that people use features to recognize letters using a visual search task. Look at this example. Which is more difficult to find, a Z or a Q? Neisser found that these participants took longer to find a Z because the other letters have similar features like straight and angular lines. One final bottom-up model is prototype matching. This prototype matching model states that we compare each new input with a stored prototype model or an ideal representation of some class of objects. It is a flexible model because an exact match is not necessary between the input and the prototype. We actually form and use prototypes in our everyday perception, as demonstrated by Cabeza, Bruce, Kato, and Oda in their 1999 study. Research participants were more likely to recognize prototype faces that they had never actually seen before than to recognize older, less prototypical new faces. The bottom-up models of pattern recognition have a number of limitations. One of the major problems is context effects. The context surrounding a pattern or object creates expectations in the perceiver as to what objects will occur. One example is the face-mouse illusion. Look at the pictures shown for a moment. Now look at this picture. What do you see? Do the same with these pictures. Now what do you see? This is a good example of context effects for pattern recognition. Even though you saw the same picture after each set of pictures, you are probably more likely to see a face after looking at faces and a mouse after looking at animals. These context effects have led many psychologists to argue that any model of perception must incorporate context and expectations.
Because of the problem of context and expectation effects, psychologists developed a new model of perception known as top-down processing. These processes are directed by expectation based on previous learning and/or context. In other words, our knowledge and expectations guide our behavior when perceiving objects. Perceptual learning, or the idea that perception changes with practice, also supports the theory of top-down processing. According to previous research, when shown similar objects, participants falsely recognize a similar object as the original, even though this may not be the case. Over time, participants are able to notice more distinctive qualities of the object that were not previously noticed. In relation to top-down processes, the participants' experience with the task allowed them to focus on relevant information and perceive the objects separately. Another illustration of a top-down process involves change blindness. Change blindness is the inability to recognize changes to an object or scene. This occurs in television shows as well as movies when a scene is shot several times, yet the set is not exactly the same as it was before, resulting in minute mistakes. These mistakes, such as different colored ties or missing chess pieces, are often undetected by viewers. Changes in the scene that do not affect the scene's overall meaning often go unnoticed. This phenomenon supports the idea of top-down processing. Our perception is guided by our expectations of the overall meaning of a scene or object. Instead of focusing on the minute details, we are often interested in the scene's overall meaning and thus perceive it accordingly. Look at this picture. Now look at this one. Most people wouldn't have noticed the differences in chairs in the background, but now that you know about change blindness, you most likely recognize the difference. The word superiority effect also demonstrates our usage of top-down processes. When trying to identify a letter presented on a screen for a brief amount of time, participants performed best when the letter was in the context of a word, rather than presented individually or in a jumbled word. The ability to perceive letters in a familiar context rather than an unfamiliar one shows how top-down processes incorporate expectations and past experiences when perceiving objects. Ultimately, top-down and bottom-up processes interact with one another. Otherwise, we would never be able to perceive new stimuli that we had never encountered. One model that incorporates both top-down and bottom-up processes is David Marr's model. Marr believed that we develop 3 different mental sketches in order to guide our visual perception. The first is known as a primal sketch, which serves as a 2-dimensional image depicting brightness and darkness. After the primal sketch is formed, the perceiver develops a 2.5-dimensional sketch, which includes shading, texture, edges, and other qualities. This allows for depth perception. Finally, a 3-dimensional sketch is formed with the help of real-world knowledge and expectations, thus incorporating top-down processes. These top-down processes allow for a final understanding of the image being formed.
Ultimately, all 3 of these perceptual processes, Gestalt, bottom-up, and top-down, interact with one another. They allow us to make quick and accurate decisions when necessary. In reality, pattern recognition incorporates our initial expectations as well as the context in which the object lies.